Hello, friends. Hi, everyone. Welcome back, Inspired Writers. So happy to be here today for part 2 of our Inspire Writing Art and Writing series. Today is part 2 of our Art and Writing series. So if you missed part 1, it was all about the basics of drawing florals. So it's going to be super helpful to kind of go back to that session, watch the replay. It's available anytime under the Past Sessions tab on the Mont Blanc website. But we're also going to do a quick review today, as you probably noticed in your workbook. Today's part 2 is going to be how to integrate painting into your drawings with ink and watercolor. So as usual, you have your traceable workbook. But since today we're also going to be painting, I hope that you were able to grab some what's called mixed media paper, which basically means you can paint on it, you can write on it, or some watercolor paper. If all you have today is regular printer paper, that is totally fine. I'm all about removing all barriers to getting creative, so regular printer paper is just fine for today. But I just want to talk a little bit about paper here for a moment because it is a question that I got a lot at the end of last class, was on the specific materials that I recommend for doing this technique with painting and writing. Okay, so when it comes to paper, I'm going to be using what's called hot press watercolor paper. There's two kinds of watercolor paper, hot press and cold press, okay? Hot press refers to how smooth the paper is, so it's nice and thick, and it has a little bit of texture, but overall it has quite a smooth feel to it, which is really good when you want to add writing or calligraphy to your work. Cold press, by contrast, so the painting that I did here is on cold press paper, and hopefully you can zoom in here and see some of those textured details. So it's a lot more textured, it's raised, and it can hold a lot more water. So if you're doing like a detailed watercolor painting, then cold pressed paper is really good for that. But for the purposes of what you're going to be learning from me today, hot press paper or, some simple mixed media paper are just fine. I'm actually also going to be showing you how I can paint inside the Mont Blanc sketchbook. So like I said, any paper that you have is going to be okay today. In terms of writing instruments, so what pen or pencil you're using today, I would love for you to grab a ruler ball or a ballpoint pen, your favorite fountain pen if you have one, and a pencil with an eraser. So pencil is always our secret weapon. I love to use pencil when I'm doing my drawing classes because it just kind of takes the fear of the blank page away. So definitely grab pencil. The next most important tool is ink. So I'm lucky to have a little collection started. You can see some of it behind me here on the gold blocks. And I'm going to be talking to you about what's called permanent ink and what's called water-soluble ink. So a lot of the Mont Blanc fountain pen inks are water-soluble, which means that if you add water, then it's going to you're able to blend it out and paint with it easily. But it also means that if you're writing with water-soluble ink and then you apply water to it, that ink is going to bleed. Versus permanent ink, when you lay down the ink and you apply water to it, it's not going to smudge or bleed. So what's new is that in addition to writing and drawing, like you learned in part 1, we're also going to be adding color, which means that we need to add a paintbrush into the mix. And so I don't want this to be a barrier for you. I mentioned this at the end of the last class. All I wanted you to have on hand today is any round watercolor paintbrush. So round just refers to the shape of the tip of the paintbrush. And so I love size 6. That refers to the size of the tip of the paintbrush. By contrast, this is a size 16. You'll always see the size on the barrel of your paintbrush. In terms of brands, I would be happy to share my favorite brands with you over on Instagram after the class. But again, when you're first starting out, any round paintbrush, just so you can get a handle on this technique, is going to be perfectly fine. So round size 6 or round size 4, here's the difference between those two, I find are really great for painting things like florals. The next thing you're going to need is a cup of water. So this is my painting cup. It's a plastic cup. And I fill it kind of halfway or all the way to the top. Today I did halfway because I'm afraid that I'll dump it all over my desktop here, and that would just be terrible in a live class. So I'm trying to eliminate any accidents by only filling it up halfway, but a little cup of water is going to go a long way. And paper towel, plain old paper towel, or even a dish rag. but paper towel is definitely the most convenient piece of paper towel because you don't want to have too much water on your paintbrush. So the paper towel is just to help eliminate having any puddles on your paper. Lastly, if you have a ceramic plate or a little mixing surface, I'm going to be using this little basic mixing surface here with a little bit of my black Mont Blanc ink that I'm going to be diluting with water. So let's start with our coil here. And this circular movement is what's going to help you most for creating things like petal shapes. It's also going to help you loosen up. So the idea here is to move fast and experiment with your scale. So don't feel like you have to trace the coil that I did here. That's just there for an example. I just want you to start moving your hand in a fast motion, overlapping some of your coils, and start experimenting with holding your pen in different ways. So the higher up on the barrel you are of your writing instrument, the less controlled your strokes are going to be. So sometimes when you're drawing, you don't want things to look too perfect. So you can see I'm really high up on the barrel of my rollerball right now, which means that I'm getting way less uniform strokes, which when you're creating something like florals, is actually quite nice. So we'll start with our little coil shapes here. So similar to the coil that you did here, we're going to make them a lot closer together. And the closer together your little coil shapes are, the darker the area. So start trying to even overlap, do a section of coils, and then start overlapping that section. And this is really good for doing things like the stamen of the flower. And if you spread them out a little bit more, that indicates a lighter area. So the closer together your strokes are, the darker the area, the farther apart they are, the lighter the area. Another really good one is just doing almost like a spiral shape. I use this when I'm drawing the center of flowers a lot. And once you create your first spiral, say you wanted to create a darker section, right in the center, I'm just going over top of that area with my pen, and it becomes even darker. Then you have your upstrokes, your downstrokes. Again, unlike calligraphy, when we're drawing here, the goal is to just loosen up and do some faster strokes. If you were to cross over onto your strokes, this is called hatching. That's another shading technique if you want to add more detail to your drawings. And especially if you have a flexible nib, which I'll switch over so you can see the difference here. Sometimes you don't want all of your strokes to be too uniform. And so I'm using my flex nib here to start out by pressing, and I'm getting a thicker stroke. And as I release pressure, I get a thinner stroke. So you can see how this will be really effective for the center of flowers as well. So again, your C curve, if you were to draw this leaf shape here, we're doing kind of that backwards C shape. And on each side of that stem, you're doing two other C curves. So you find the center of the leaf and then you go C curve. And on this back side here, I'm going to do a S curve. So that in essence is how you draw a very simple leaf. And then on the right here, you can see that I'm integrating a little bit more movement with those S curves, but you always want to follow the center line of that leaf. And for your shading to follow the direction that your curve is going. So what that means is the line of line and wash, the line is your drawing. So the line is your drawing. And the wash is your diluted ink or your watercolor. So line and wash is the integration of ink and watercolor. It doesn't have to be ink. It could be something like pencil, but because we're using our beautiful Mont Blanc fountain pens, I think it's really cool that you can learn this technique using ink, and it is something that has been done for centuries. So there's a couple of ways to do line and wash. The first is that you start with your wash and create your line drawing on top. So we would start by painting kind of basic shapes in watercolor, and then you would add your line on top of that. So this is really great if you want to add form to a really quick watercolor sketch. I want to talk about the types of ink that you can use in your drawings so that your line work is either water soluble or it's permanent. And so I have an example of both here. I have my permanent Mont Blanc black ink, and I have my water-soluble Mont Blanc black ink. What happens when you use a water-soluble ink to do your line drawing and then you add water to it is that the line work is going to start bleeding. And that's an effect in and of its own. I actually think it's quite cool. But if you don't want that effect and you want your line drawing to stay intact, you would do your line work with a permanent black ink in your fountain pen. And that way, when you add your watercolor or your wash on top, it's not going to bleed. And so I've shown you an example of both here where I've drawn with the permanent black ink and I've done a wash over top and it retains the integrity of the line drawing, versus on the left side is with a water-soluble ink, and when you put water on top, it starts to bleed a little bit. So in terms of the two techniques that I just went through, if you're using a water-soluble ink, you probably want to create your wash first, and once that wash is dry, you go back and you create your line drawing on top, versus if you have a permanent ink, you can do either of these techniques. So if you have any questions on if your ink is permanent or where to find permanent ink, I'm sure Mont Blanc would be happy to help. But specifically, you want to use either permanent or water-soluble ink for the line drawing portion. So for the wash portion, you can use watercolor, you can use any ink color. And what we're going to do is dilute that a little bit. So let's move on to that section of our lesson here, which is learning how to create light and dark values for your wash. So one of the biggest misconceptions with watercolor or diluting ink is that to make it lighter, so if you want a lighter version of your black ink, a lot of people think that you need to add white to it in order for it to get lighter. But really, all you have to do is add water. So I'm going to rearrange my desk here a little bit and bring over my ink. So I have my ink in a little palette here. I have my water cup in front of me. I have my paper towel on standby in case I need to dip that out. Perfect. So I want you to just watch me for a moment, and then I'm going to tell you all about how to hold your brush and all that fun stuff. But I just want you to watch me for a moment. Again, if you are familiar more with painting in acrylics, then this first lay down that I'm doing, I'm just wetting my paintbrush here, and I'm going to dip it into my ink. That first stroke that you lay down is going to be very opaque, so you're not going to be able to see through it. Then I want you to rinse your brush in your water and just start to drag that ink out. And I want even more water, and we want to drag it out even further. And you'll notice that just by adding water, you almost get to a completely transparent gradient. And so this is your value. So when you want to create a darker value, so if you want to show a shadow in your work, then you would want to use your darker value. Whereas when you are wanting to indicate a lighter area of your work, then you would want to dilute that ink until you get an almost transparent shade here. So you watch me do that, and now you're probably wondering, okay, how do I do that myself? So you want the paintbrush when you're dipping it in your water. So I'm just swishing it around in my water here. You want it to be wet but not dripping. So right now my paintbrush is dripping, so I'm tapping it off on the side of my water, and then I'm just giving it a little tap on my paper towel so that there's nothing that's going to be dripping from my paintbrush. This is going to come with practice, just like learning calligraphy, and that's kind of in essence. Again, there's no specific way to hold a paintbrush. I tend to hold it the same way that I hold my calligraphy brushes, which is my thumb and my index finger on the top, my middle finger on the bottom. The farther up on the barrel of the paintbrush, the less control you have. The closer down, the more control you have. So again, if you're working with thinner paper, the less water, the better. So even, again, if I was working with some thinner paper here, I would just add less water, and you'd be able to achieve this effect on any surface. So I just want you to experiment a little bit with the different shades you can create by adding more or less water to your ink. Like I said, when you want to activate the thickest part, the widest part of your paintbrush, you're pushing down on the belly of your paintbrush. And when you want to create a thin line, you're on the tip of your paintbrush. When you start with the wash, you're creating your, ink swatch, or you're creating your watercolor swatch first, and then you're adding your details on top once it's dry. So it has to be completely dry to the touch, and then you add your details on top. So I have lots of examples to show you here to hopefully inspire you. So this is an example where I created the wash. So I did the color first, really loose and gestural, and then I went in with my line work on top. Same with this example. This is really fun to do with florals. So you just literally create blobs of color for all of your florals, and then you go in with your line work over top afterwards. This is a really simple example, so that's why I included it in the workbook here. So all I did with my Mont Blanc ink in yellow and the sepia orange color is I laid down a few kind of gestural strokes with my paintbrush. Once it was dry, I went in and created these sort of basic petal shapes, adding some line work details afterwards. So I included that in your workbook so you have something to go off of. This is the example on the bottom left. So what I did, again, I just did some basic petal shapes using one of my Mont Blanc inks that I diluted with a ton of water. And once that was dry, I added these kind of curved stem shapes. So this is really fun for if you were creating like a birthday card or something like that. Another really quick examples of how to do that, where to create a tree, I just laid down some different values with my diluted ink, and then I went in and created some structure with my line work afterwards. Same with this plant example on the right. I think will be really fun that I just want to quickly show you how fast this is if, again, this is with my Mont Blanc ink that I diluted, and I kind of created all of these different lines that are bleeding into one another, and then you can go in with something like your flexible nib, and you can just lightly outline those shapes. So depending on which direction they're going in, like this. Again, not being too prescriptive. I'm mimicking the calligraphy technique of down, thicker line, up, thinner line. And what you can do is create little candle shapes on top and make this like a birthday card. And you could add some wash into the tips of the candle, and then you could write either in your printing or in your calligraphy, happy birthday. I'm just doing my regular printing down here, but if I had more space, then maybe I would do a more detailed, but like that is a super, super fun and simple example. If you had multiple colors, I think that would be even cooler. I have an example of some abstracts. So one thing that I always recommend you do is create swatches on a piece of paper and then just go in and draw inside of those swatches. Another fun example is just having a bookmark. So I cut out a piece of watercolor paper. I did a basic wash in the center, and then you can just go in with your C curves. And remember, you kind of want leaves bigger at the bottom, kind of slowly getting smaller towards the top. C curve, S curve, and you can go in and add as much line work as you want. Up, down, up. Really simple, starting with wash, adding our line technique. So I create these bookmarks usually as gifts for people that I'm adding to, a card that I've already made for them. So I included this sketch within your workbook. I just printed it on printer paper, but I just want to quickly show you with some pink watercolor here. With a little bit of wash, you can just add some really fun definition to your work. So again, I'm leaving lots of white space using really gestural C curves, and I might even leave some petals not painted or just the bottoms of the petals. And maybe for the center, I'm going to add another shade. And because I'm not using watercolor paper here, this is just regular printer paper, it's not bleeding into each other. But if you were using something like watercolor paper, or in this instance, this is the Mont Blanc sketchbook, maybe I'll use a little bit of yellow watercolor here and just show you how that watercolor is bleeding into the pen, because in the center flowers, I use my water-soluble ink. So I actually quite like that effect. If you don't like that effect, then you want to use your permanent ink. I've been working on a really special project that you'll hear about soon, but not quite yet, where I had to paint some watercolor forget-me-nots. And because I'm loving this line and wash style, I drew the forget-me-not flowers first. Hopefully you can see that. I drew the flowers first, and then leaving lots of white space, I went in with my wash afterwards just to add some detail and dimension. So on the right side here, I don't have any paint in there yet. And I have my Mont Blanc black ink here that I'm just going to dilute down with some water. I've lost my paper towel, so I'm just going to drag it on the edges here to get that off. And I think that I just want to, again, do some gestural strokes to give the shape of the flower, but not paint the whole thing in. So you always want to follow the curve of the flower, leaving some white space. And I'm kind of getting this nice purpley effect, which I love. And I might only paint one side of a shape. Again, you don't want to overthink this too much. I'm just using my black to dip in, and you're getting a few little bleeds here. And once that was dry, because I already did the line work, but once this is dry, I could actually go over top of that again with ink and add even more detail. So I really do like using permanent ink for my line drawing, and then using watercolor ink to kind of add dimension, and then kind of going back and adding more detailed line work afterwards. So I've given you lots of homework ideas, and hopefully you can see how really inspiring all of these techniques are, and how to use your ink in new ways. I would love to see you created today. And our next class, part 3, is actually on April 11th, where we're going to be combining our drawing, our painting, and calligraphy to create what I'm calling a word garden. So we're actually going to be writing calligraphy for the stems, and then creating our drawings and adding wash afterwards. So if you can get your hands on some permanent ink before then, that would be fabulous. Again, not required. As you can see from all of my sessions, I like to, make this as barrier-free as possible. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you.